Welcome to the deep dive. If you're a PhD student, maybe a junior researcher, especially in fields like economics, finance, econometrics, well, you know what we're talking about today. It's that huge pressure cooker,
Ah,
academic writing. Specifically, the thesis. It's probably the longest, most closely examined thing you'll ever write. And the anxiety around it. It can be completely overwhelming. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how hard you work.
absolutely. And that anxiety, that stress really comes down to something quite simple and frustrating. The thesis is critical for your career, for academic success, but almost nobody gets any real formal training in how to actually write one well. You're suddenly expected to be an expert researcher and a sophisticated writer. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that fear. We want to give you some specific practical frameworks. Treat writing like a skill you can actually train and manage.
Okay, let's dive into why it feels so uniquely paralyzing. The sources we looked at had this great comparison, the brain surgery analogy.
Yes. That one's helpful. Think about it. Brain surgeons, they handle extreme high-stakes situations constantly, but they manage. They cope because they're trained. They see a complication, they recognize it, they have a whole set of known solutions, and they apply the right one fast.
Right. And the contrast is the PhD student experience.
Exactly. With PhD writing, because there isn't that standardized teaching, when you hit a problem, maybe you can't figure out how chapter 2 should lead into chapter 3, it feels like you're totally alone, like you're inventing the solution from scratch. Every single roadblock feels new, unique, and that's what really ramps up the anxiety.
Mm.
But the reality is, good writers, they aren't just born that way. They're usually just people who spend enough time bumping into these kinds of structural problems that they now recognize patterns. They can adapt and apply solutions much more quickly.
That really changes the perspective, doesn't it? It moves it away from, am I smart enough for this, towards,
Towards, I haven't learned this specific skill yet, and I need a system, a framework.
okay. So skill number one is structure. You're saying academic writing is essentially taking all those connected ideas and data points floating around in your head, that tangled mess, the sources call it, and you have to somehow translate that into a straight line, a linear document someone can actually read one sentence at a time.
Precisely. That's the core challenge, building that linear flow from the complex web in your mind.
So how do we build that line? Is there a basic scaffold, something that works pretty much everywhere?
There is. At its heart, the structure is a kind of chain. It's about cause and response. You can think of almost any research piece as following roughly 4 phases.
Yeah.
First, there's a cause or stimulus, maybe a real-world event, new data, something happens. Second, a problem or question pops up because of that stimulus. Third, you have the effects. That's where your investigation comes in, or how the academic field has responded in publications. And finally, you get a partial answer and maybe some other consequences. And often, that loops right back around to create the next problem or question.
Can we make that a bit more concrete? Say, for someone listening who works on financial markets, how does that sequence play out practically?
Okay, good idea. Let's take a policy impact study. The cause could be a new financial regulation, say something passed in 2018 aiming to stabilize markets. The problem that arises might be an unintended consequence. Maybe it creates a weird market distortion, or volatility spikes in a specific derivative market. You see the link?
Yeah, okay. Regulation leads to distortion.
Right. Then the effect is your academic investigation. Papers trying to measure that distortion, maybe models trying to explain why it happened, and your thesis might provide a partial answer. Perhaps you develop a new econometric model to capture it better. But that answer then creates new consequences or questions, maybe about the long-term effectiveness of that original regulation. See how it flows. Every piece should fit one of these roles.
That kind of thinking must be super useful for the introduction chapter. That's often where people get really stuck. Our sources had a pretty clear framework for that too.
Yes, a very reliable 5-step sequence. It works for almost any project introduction. 1. Describe the general situation or event. For example, maybe the growing number of PhD students worldwide and the intense competition they face. 2. Describe the specific problem that comes out of that, like evidence showing high levels of stress among these students. 3. Briefly explain how others have already tried to address this, maybe limited university support programs or previous studies that touched on it. 4. Explain why we need a different approach. What's the gap? Perhaps there's very little research on whether those support programs actually work. And 5. State clearly what your research is going to do to fill that specific gap.
Okay, we have this sequence. But PhD topics, they're really complex, nuanced. If I just follow these 5 steps rigidly, isn't there a danger, it sounds?
Well, a bit like filling in a form, not like deep scholarship. That's a fair point, and it's where the skill comes in. The framework is the skeleton. It gives you clarity, it gives you structure. That certainty is hugely valuable. Any risk of sounding slightly formulaic is, frankly, much less damaging than being structurally incoherent. And you handle the nuance by doing what the material calls hanging detail off the structure. If you need more complexity, you don't ditch the step. You add layers within that step, more evidence, more data, more subtle points. But you keep the underlying flow. That's key. And it makes editing later so much easier because everything has its place.
And you can apply this idea elsewhere too, right? Like when introducing a theory, don't just define it.
Exactly. Embedded in the story. Frame theory acts as a response. Why did it come about? Maybe a big discovery in, say, 1967 completely blew up the old models. Or maybe Theory X was developed specifically to fix a flaw someone found in an earlier approach. If you put everything into that kind of cause and effect narrative, it just clicks better for the reader. It's more engaging.
That idea of narrative leads us straight into probably the most dreaded chapter for many, the literature review. If the aim isn't just summarizing everything, what's the big mental shift needed there?
The shift is crucial. It's moving from proving how much you've read to proving why your research is necessary and relevant. Your job is not like an undergrad exam where you list everything you know, worried you'll lose points for missing something. Forget that. The goal is to curate. Select the best, most relevant sources to weave an interesting story, a narrative that clearly shows the gap your work fills, and frame every single paper you discuss as a response to a situation, a question, or often a response to a problem identified in a previous paper.
So instead of just paper A says this, paper B says that, you start broader,
Yes.
like describing a trend or a debate in the field.
Precisely. You set the stage first. Something like, research in this area is really accelerated recently, particularly since Method Y was developed. Then the papers you choose become the evidence. They illustrate parts of that trend, or maybe they represent different sides of a key debate. Another way is to trace the lineage from a seminal paper. Start with the big problem. Introduce Smith's 1980 paper as the first major attempt at a solution. Then discuss how later work tried to fix the shortcomings in Smith's approach, or refine the technique. It gives the whole chapter direction and purpose. It stops it being just a list.
Okay, let's shift from the writing mechanics to overall strategy. The materials had some really powerful advice about controlling the narrative, essentially viewing your thesis as choosing your own syllabus for the examiner.
Yes, that's such a vital insight, especially for junior researchers.
Yeah.
You have to play to your strengths, not obsess over weaknesses. What often happens is people worry they'll get caught out. Maybe there's a foundational theory they don't feel 100% solid on. So they spend ages trying to pad out that section in the thesis, trying to cover all bases. But ironically, that often just shines a spotlight on the weaker area and invites critical questions there.
So the idea is your thesis defines the ground you're prepared to defend. Write most deeply, most extensively about what you know best. Actively pull the examiner onto your strongest territory. If you need to cover, say, 50 years of background theory, just for context, maybe do it very concisely. A dense paragraph, heavily referenced, just to set the scene.
Exactly. Clear the decks quickly, then dedicate the real space, the depth, to where your expertise truly lies.
That variation in depth seems key.
It is. If you're primarily an experimentalist, for example, cover the essential theoretical background efficiently. Perhaps summarize decades of development briefly. Then, spend your pages detailing your experimental design, your data analysis, your modeling, the things that are your core contribution. You guide the conversation by how you distribute the detail.
All right, let's talk process management. Sitting down to write, where should you actually start? The sources strongly advise against jumping around, which I think many of us do.
Yes, the advice is clear. Start with the introduction and try to work sequentially. Follow the path the reader will take through the document. Now, when you hit a block, and you absolutely will hit blocks, the temptation is huge. You want to jump to an easier section, maybe write up the methodology or results, because you know that stuff. But doing that just kicks the can down the road. It postpones the difficult structural problems, and it means you're not actually practicing or developing the skill of solving those problems. You need that discipline. Focus on solving the one specific issue in front of you. How do I connect this last idea logically to the next one I need to make? Solve that before you move on.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, though. If I'm really stuck on phrasing something in the intro and hours are ticking by, isn't jumping to methods, which I feel confident about, at least good for generating some words, keeping momentum?
I understand the temptation. It feels productive, doesn't it? You see the word count go up. But often, those words written out of sequence need massive rewriting later anyway, precisely because the core argument structure wasn't solid when you wrote them. You really need to build that muscle memory for solving the structural linkage problems. If you're stuck, the answer isn't usually to run away from it, it's to find an adequate connection. Not perfect, but adequate to move forward.
And this links directly to that idea of the perfectionism scale, right? We don't want to be careless, obviously,
Oh, that guarantees poor work.
but we also don't want total perfectionism where nothing ever gets finished. How do we actually find that sweet spot day to day, especially when we're stressed?
You use momentum as a weapon against that fear. Set yourself a manageable, maybe even time-based word count target, something you feel you can realistically hit, even on a bad day. Perhaps aim for, say, 150, maybe 200 words an hour, or just a daily minimum, like 500 words that you know you can probably beat. This shifts the focus from, is the sentence perfect, to, am I making steady progress? However, and this is crucial, there are moments to slow right down. When you are stating the absolute core of your work, the specific aims, the objectives, your key hypotheses, be incredibly precise. That statement is effectively your contract with the examiner. It's the standard they'll judge you against. Nail that down carefully.
That discomfort you mentioned, forcing ourselves to solve those tricky linking problems that are just a bit beyond our current easy reach, that's really where the growth happens, isn't it?
That's absolutely the core of Csikszentmihalyi's flow model. When the challenge level is high, but your skill is maybe medium to high for that challenge. You enter what he calls the arousal state. It's not comfortable. It demands your full attention. You're stretching to solve something just outside your current easy grasp. A lot of PhD writing involves learning to tolerate that feeling, accept that difficulty, and channel your energy into solving the problem rather than getting overwhelmed or just giving up.
Which loops us back to the start, that initial anxiety about the final outcome, the examination. You can't actually know for sure what the examiner will think. So where does real confidence come from in this process?
Yeah, it's not about being certain you'll succeed. Confidence, in this context, is more about accepting the uncertainty, but trusting your ability to cope with whatever happens. You free up so much mental energy when you can shift from, oh God, what if the examiner hates it, to something more like, okay, maybe they won't like everything, but whatever feedback I get, good or bad, I have the skills and resilience to handle it and move forward. Believing in your capacity to cope with the worst case allows you to just focus on doing the best work you can right now.
So this whole deep dive really underscores that academic writing, even at the PhD level, isn't some kind of innate mystical talent. It's a skill. It's manageable. It's trainable. If you use structural frameworks, focus on the narrative, and critically learn to embrace that discomfort that comes with real learning and growth.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought for listeners. If you find yourself truly deeply stuck on a sentence or a transition, try this mental shift. Stop searching for the perfect solution. Ask instead, what's an adequate solution? What word, what phrase accurately gets the idea across and, crucially, lets me successfully link to the very next point I need to make? Sometimes searching for perfection keeps you stuck in a loop. Finding a functional way forward, even if it feels imperfect, is nearly always the better choice. Keep the momentum